In the late 1980s, I asked my mother, Bertha Helen Schultz, to record some of her memories of the life of her parents, herself, and our family. She decided that a tape recorder would not work for her and instead, in February 1989, wrote out 22 pages plus little odd notes on other pieces of paper. She apologized for the randomness of her notes, but at the same time was able to provide good insight into her life. Many of the things I had heard at some time, but these notes revealed some unexpected information. I will here attempt to put her notes into chronological order and to fill in gaps wherever I can do so. To the extent possible, I will use her own words but will freely edit and revise with the aim of communicating her story as I understand it. I will keep the original notes if anyone wishes to refer to them. Where I insert things that are purely my own thoughts or memories, I will italicize them and put such statements in brackets. I make no claim to be a writer and do this in hopes that this paper will be of interest to others, especially my children and grandchildren.
Bertha's parents, Charles Marshall and Caroline Gatska, both came from Polish Russia, living about 20 miles from Warsaw, but did not meet until they were in New York City.
Other notes I have state that Caroline was born near Necharva and Charles may have been born near Lipno.
Charles came to the United States at the age of 18 in 1891, and Caroline entered the United States through Ellis Island in 1892.
Several times I heard Bertha tell a story that must have come from her father. He had been in New York only a short time, did not yet speak English, and saw what he thought to be nice big red apples on a peddler's cart. He purchased one and was most disappointed when he bit into it, as it was soft and full of seeds. It turned out that it was a tomato, a fruit he had never previously seen.
As a small child, Bertha heard her parents talk of Czechoslovakia.
She wondered if that was nearby, as she understood them to say they had walked to Czechoslovakia. When I told her the distance, she said she was sure that was too far to walk. I rather believe that the people may have indeed walked that far over quite a long period of time. After all, there was only walking or use of horses in some fashion at the time.
Charles and Caroline were married October 4, 1896 at St. Paul's Lutheran Church in Mount Vernon, New York, with Christian F. Sommer officiating.
No information on how or when they met.
Since friends of Charles and Caroline had gone to the Vergas, Minnesota area, Charles left his wife and young daughter Bertha in New York to investigate the area. During the summer of 1898, he made arrangements for Caroline and Bertha to join him in Minnesota. They were joined by a friend, Attilia, for the long train journey. It was dark when they arrived at their destination, so they hired a driver and team to take them to the house where they would stay. On the way, there were houses with lights, and the young women joked about the chicken coops with lights. The driver told them that was the kind of place they were headed to. The next day found Caroline with the baby, sitting behind the straw pile, crying. She did not like the country. Charles agreed to find work in Perham and a place to live. The first living quarters were in the second floor over a business place on the main street, now Highway 10, in town. Eventually, they bought a house on the south edge of town on the east side of what is now Highway 78. Brother William was born June 21, 1899. Another son was stillborn December 31, 1900, and was buried in Gormantown, aka Borg, Cemetery. Williams was a very difficult birth, and he lay in convulsions constantly for 9 days and nights. After William was out of convulsions, he cried constantly. He must have slept sometimes. This was an added problem, as it was necessary to keep the baby quiet during the day so Charles could sleep, as he worked nights at the Globe Flour Mill. His work shifts were not merely the 8-hour ones of modern times.
He probably worked at least 6 days a week and likely 12 hours a day.
Caroline often remarked that William's little body looked just like the skull and crossbones that were depicted on poison containers. William was 3 years old before he could sit up. The old doctor urged them to dig a hole in the earth big enough to put him in a sitting position so he could draw strength from the earth.
As Bertha described William's condition, it sounded to me that he had brain injury during the birth process. Perhaps lack of oxygen. Perhaps physical injury. Bertha had a huge scar on her forehead that she attributed to a slip of a forceps during her birth. I remember her telling me that she talked with many doctors about William's condition and was reassured that it was not hereditary. She said she would never have married if she thought such a condition could be passed on to her children.
Since Caroline had plenty to do to care for a sick baby, Bertha was often left to find her own things to occupy her time. Bertha considered herself a neighborhood nuisance at times. She remembers being sent home from the neighbors because they wanted the children to take a nap, or else maybe the children were sick. When the circus came to town, it set up the tents on what is now the fairgrounds about 2 blocks from where the Marshalls lived. Charles took Bertha to the circus. As a young girl, Bertha was often given responsibilities. One time Caroline gave her a silver dollar and sent her to the store with a little wagon to get a cloth bag of sugar. The grocer loaded the sugar in the wagon and Bertha trotted home with it. At one point Bertha remembered sugar as costing 10 cents a pound and later said maybe it was only 5 cents. Charles developed some sort of breathing problems. Bertha suspected sinus from Miller dust and was ordered to get out in the fresh air. A tract of land was purchased and a log house and a log barn were built using trees cut from the site along with other trees for the logs. They found that a cellar
to store potatoes, etc.,
was an absolute necessity, so a hole was dug,
probably under the house.
Since it was clay soil, nothing more was done in terms of walls or support for the sides of the hole. 50 years later Bertha talked with the people who bought the place, and they said they could still see the spade marks in the clay walls of the cellar. Cows, horses, chickens, pigs, and geese were kept. May 1, 1903, the family moved to their new home.
Apparently this was in Gormantown, northwest of Perham.
Since it was such a nice warm spring, they were anxious to get out there and plant a garden. Somehow, somewhere, a team of horses and a wagon with a hayrack were obtained. The family and their possessions were loaded and on the way to the new home. That could not have been all the family possessions. It was dark by the time they got there. The next morning there was snow on the bed, having come through between the logs that had only been kinked out. No mud or mortar was used, the local clay being deemed good enough. The snow was deep enough that Bertha had trouble trudging through it. Charles and Caroline carried the children to the neighbors where they stayed.
She didn't say how long, but apparently until the storm ended.
While there, Bertha was coaxed into the upstairs via a ladder on the side of the wall. She most likely slept there,
probably with other children.
Getting down was another story. Bertha was scared silly at the prospect of climbing down that ladder. Finally Charles came to check on them and saved the day by having Bertha drop into his arms. Naturally the snow melted soon and they returned to their own house, which was then warm enough. While at the neighbors, Bertha reported being brainwashed.
Did she mean teased?
She didn't know all the reasons, but Charles wanted to name her Helen, and Caroline's sister insisted on Bertha. Charles called her Helen after leaving New York City. The people at the neighbor's house, where they stayed during the storm, insisted that Helen was not her name, and that it was not even a pretty name. A hole was dug in the clay, and a roof was fashioned over it using a layer of hazel brush covered with mud. A chicken-tight fence was made by setting posts and using 3 long slender rails between each set of posts, then weaving hazel brush through the rails in an alternating fashion. After 50 years, the owners asked Bertha about that fence, as parts of it were still to be found. Water was needed, so a hole was dug in the swamp and boarded up so the dirt wouldn't cave in. Soon a well was dug nearer the house, and an iron pump was in use. Caroline raised geese for food and feathers. A small area was cleared by cutting the trees, and both parents grubbed out those stumps so they would have a patch to seed. The wheat was eventually used to make bread. When the parents were working quite a distance from the house, 6-year-old Bertha was responsible to keep the fire going in the cook stove and watch William. She had to peel the potatoes and put them on to boil when the big clock said 11, and then call her parents in for dinner. The potato kettle was a large cast iron one with a round bottom that fit into the opening in the top of the wood-burning cook stove. One year, probably 1904, on William's birthday on June 21st, Bertha asked Caroline to bake a cake, and she would pick some blueberries. Bertha returned home with a 2-quart paint pail full to the brim with blueberries. It was considered too early for blueberries, so the next day Caroline insisted that she be shown where they were found ripe so early. Well, they could find only very few ripe berries. These were the low-growing ones, only a foot or less tall.
Caroline really enjoyed picking blueberries. Even in her later years, when walking was difficult for her and her hands seemed all crippled up, she could outpick everyone. She would drop everything at anyone offered to take her out blueberry picking.
Charles wanted some evergreen trees near the house, so he and Bertha went a mile or 2 where they found some that he dug up. The trees he chose were nice ones, about as tall as Bertha at age about 6 or 7. To keep Bertha amused, he allowed her to dig some up with a large spoon and plant them. The large trees didn't survive, but the little tablespoon-size ones thrived. After Charles and Caroline had a car, their first car was purchased about 1923, they drove past that former home and reported that the trees were still there. While on the farm, the Marshalls had more than 1 cow. A nearby farmer allowed them to herd the cows in the harvested field, and it was Bertha's job to watch the cows after her father had helped drive them to the field.
No doubt there were no fences, and the cattle had to be kept to a certain area.
Bertha commented that the cattle soon knew better than she did where to go. A neighbor girl from the other direction also herded cattle in the same field. Surely it could not have been many days before the cattle cleaned the field. Yet grasses and weeds do grow in the fall, and would have done so until freeze-up. During the summer months, turtles came near the buildings. There had been talk that turtles would eat baby chicks, so one day, when a large turtle was there, Bertha decided to try to kill it by making it bite on a stick so she could pull it onto a large rock, and then dropping a rock on it. She did indeed succeed in smashing it enough, so it stayed put. It was often talked about that the turtle was as large around as a washtub,
2.5 feet.
and Bertha must have worked on it a long time. Bertha fell in love with a neighbor's black colt. She did not understand that the neighbor was teasing when he said that if she stayed overnight she could have the colt. That evening she would not go home with her father, and the next morning wanted to take the colt home. Oh no! The neighbor said she had to stay all the time. That man remained on her bad list ever after. When the granary was cleaned out for the coming harvest, the teenagers would have a party in it. Most likely a dance. Somehow Bertha got to stay part of the night at such a party and remembered that the feed they had was out of this world. One day while Caroline was visiting in the house with other women, Bertha sat outside under the window. She got quite an education, with many answers to questions that her mother avoided. This may have occurred at the time that Caroline had a miscarriage. Charles would shoot wild game for food. One time he draped a sheet over himself so he could sneak closer to whatever it was he was trying to get. Caroline wouldn't let him shoot it, as she insisted it was a neighbor's dog. He snared rabbits for their meat. In season he picked wild fruit and sold some in Perham. Summer evenings they walked to the river to catch some bullheads. Bertha remembered falling asleep during such excursions. While they lived on the Gormantown farm, Bertha was old enough to go to school, but those days school was only in the winter, and it was too cold for her to walk the long distance to the nearest school. Consequently, her schooling was delayed. By the second winter on the Gormantown farm, Charles' health had improved enough, so he went to work in the Globe flour mill again. Very little attention was paid to safety codes in those days, and while he was working at the mill some ladder steps broke, and he fell a couple of floors, injuring his foot. Dr. Brabeck suggested rest. Since crutches cost money, Charles hobbled around the house using a chair as support. Evidently this went on quite a long time. Someone suggested he see a woman, some said she was Indian, who might be able to help cure him. He didn't know exactly where she lived, so he took Bertha along in the buggy so she could get out and ask directions. Finally they found the right place, and the woman manipulated his foot, claiming his toes were out of joint. Soon he went back to work. When he went back to work in the mill, he paid for board and room in town. He hired a bachelor to stay with Caroline and the children. This man's only pay was food and a place to stay. Perhaps it was his job to take care of the horses, as Caroline simply was no good with horses. This fellow was a Norwegian and attempted to teach Bertha his native language. In those years many men lived, or existed, in shacks in many places, and when and where they could earn a few dollars. They saved their money in the summer and hibernated in the winter when there was no work available. There was one little, red-headed, humpbacked fellow who let skunks den up under his shack. When the season was right for their fur he would harvest them. He did other trapping. Before the snow came he rode a bike, otherwise he walked. He was very friendly. One French-Canadian arranged with Caroline to pay her 15 cents for a gallon crock of clabbered milk. Plain yogurt now comes close, with cream, sugar and cinnamon on it. He would eat it all up right on the spot. Caroline did not like that arrangement of Charles living in town, leaving her and the children in the country. She did not like feeding the hired man when she said he did no work. She insisted we could all be together for the money spent on room and board, and it would be easier for her. Anyway, it was time for Bertha to be in school, so back to town they moved. Caroline took in washing and ironing. Charles paid her the board and room money, and she stashed that money away.
Bertha once talked of times being really tough for them. Perhaps it was during these years. She said she remembered staying in bed every Monday because that was laundry day and her only dress was being washed. Naturally, she couldn't get up until it had dried and been ironed.
The Marshalls rented a house in Perham. The land was lower than the rest of the town, so when the snow melted one year before the ground thawed, the water collected on those lots and then froze. Charles bought Bertha her only pair of ice skates. They were too large, and she was able to skate all around the house. Later she was able to use a tub to go boating on the pond. There was a windmill on the place, probably left over from when it was a farm, as there was no need for the amount of water it could pump. During a storm one day, a bachelor came over asking Caroline if she had a rope. She asked if he wanted it to hang himself. He replied that he wanted to tie up the windmill, as it was broken, and he was afraid parts would fall off and hurt someone. There was no indoor plumbing in that house and very little in all of Perham. Some new houses being built may have had plumbing. Wood was used for heat and cooking, so a woodshed was a must. There was also a barn to keep a cow and to store feed. The family also had a small garden. Charles told of laying steam pipes from the engine room of the Globe Mill to parts of town. This provided heat for the connected buildings. When repairs were necessary, each building was on its own. Wood was used to supply heat to generate steam and heat homes, so there was always a market for cordwood. Later coal came to be used because it was handier. 1/4 of a block in town was taken up by a building with a laundry. There were large vats run by a steam engine to do the washing. Drying was done in long, narrow rooms with lines to hang clothes. They had some sort of arrangement to blow air through the rooms to dry the clothes. Those were the days of wooden beer barrels. A cooper had his shop in the same block as the laundry. It is not clear what the cooper did. Perhaps he repaired barrels and or put new heads on them. Anyway, there was always a large number of barrels around. Cows were herded on the streets of Perham, and there was grumbling about the cow pies left around. People threw these out in the street to join the horse droppings, and eventually a man with a mule and cart would come by and clean the streets. William was rated as mentally retarded. At that time, a big disgrace. Many times Bertha had to hear, "Her brother's crazy and she is too." He was not toilet trained, could not walk and did not talk. Parents and sister understood his jabber and knew what he wanted. One day Charles came home an hour early for dinner. Mother was washing clothes on a scrub board. William was out in the yard when he saw father coming down the street. Brother came rushing in with, Ma, Pa. No, foolish boy. It's too early." A mare with foal was bought and Bertha was instructed to stay away from the colt to avoid injury. One day Bertha looked out and saw that William had crawled under the legs of the colt. No one dared to do anything but look and call for him to come to them. He was not hurt. Another time, he was in the old cow's way, and she picked him up in her big horns and tossed him aside. He just laughed, apparently unhurt. Charles couldn't chance it to dehorn the cow.
Dehorning a mature cow risks killing it.
So he did twist some burrs on the horns as far as they would go and then sawed off the tips. Evidently he thought that would prevent the cow from goring anyone. Later Bertha wondered if that wasn't just as dangerous. William grew stronger and harder to control. He could travel quite fast and would often run away. The easiest way to get him home was for Bertha to take the little express wagon and offer him a ride. Sometimes it was necessary to head away from home before he would get in the wagon. When it got to the stage where the family was unable to handle William, Their minister persuaded them to seek a place for him in Bethesda Lutheran Home. Nowadays, such as he received local training, and in most cases, are able to live at home. Unfortunately, Bethesda did not have space available, and he eventually was accepted at Faribault State School. They were able to toilet train him and teach him to talk. Caroline grieved so much over William's departure that she had a nervous breakdown in the form of breaking out on her face, a condition they called eczema at that time. One doctor said the eczema saved her life. Bertha also had problems with the separation from her brother.
Faribault was quite a distance from Perham, and no mention was ever made of being able to go visit him.
After William was gone, Caroline continued to do laundry for others in their home, and also did other cleaning. There were no washing machines, so this meant lots of hard work on scrub boards. This helped get them out of debt, and save enough money to once again buy some land in 1911. Prior to this purchase, there had been talk of Canadian homesteading and migration, but that of course didn't happen. They purchased 80 acres located about 3 miles south of Richville. This land became available because the previous owners were taking their 7 boys and 1 girl to Canada to homestead. It was never learned how these folks fared in Canada. Charles and Caroline moved to the Richville property in April 1911, leaving Bertha in Perham to complete some religious instruction. Bertha lived with a family in the capacity of babysitter for a very heavy 2-year-old boy. She remembered that he could walk, but if he fell down and couldn't get up, it was up to her to lift him. Bertha was confirmed in the Lutheran faith on April 11, 1911, and rejoined her parents at Richville before the end of May. The Richville farm had a log house and an old log barn, but no cellar, which was essential to storage of potatoes. The former owner had stored potatoes at the neighbors. So again a hole was dug, but the soil was sandy, so it was necessary to build a log wall support to prevent cave-ins. It was roofed with earth, straw and soil. Nothing froze in the root cellar. There was a wooden hand-operated pump on the well to bring up water. Cattle drank from a wooden trough, which had been hewn from a large log. It was too small to hold enough for all the cows when they came for water, so it meant that Bertha had to get out there when they arrived and pump until all had their fill. The school district moved the schoolhouse to 2 acres of the 80 acres, so Bertha had only a short walk to school. She went home for dinner, noon, most days except in extreme weather. The 2 years on this farm were very busy as land was being cleared of scrub trees and brush. Charles just had to pick and pile up every twig and root before he considered the land fit to plow. Nothing could be left for green fertilizer.
Green fertilizer is the vegetation that is plowed under and left to rot, thus providing nutrients in the soil.
A chicken coop was built and a chicken-tight fence was erected around the garden. They tried unsuccessfully to raise geese, but did manage to raise a few ducks. Once a week the family visited the neighbors, and once a week the neighbors visited them. Cards were played, but since Caroline did not play and refused to learn, a neighbor bachelor joined them to be the 4th player. Kids didn't play cards. Bertha expressed shock at what went on with a boy and girl there. She wouldn't join in. Once a week, as long as car roads were suitable, a Perham banker came out to get Caroline to wash, iron, clean and do some baking. He would pick her up late in the day, and she would usually stay in Perham 2 days. At least once she was to start walking home, and Charles and Bertha were to meet her with the team and wagon. They left home when chores were done and ended up driving all the way to Perham, as they couldn't find her. After a search of places she might have gone, they gave up and headed home. A rainstorm was coming up and they feared hail, which could cause troubles with the horses. The hail didn't arrive, so they made the trip safely. This was a late Saturday night, and no doubt Charles slept poorly, if at all. As a result, he did not feel like getting up early enough to do the chores and make it to 10 o'clock church services in Perham. Eventually Caroline arrived home, having walked all the way from Perham.
About 11 miles.
Saturday night dancing parties were the main entertainment, mostly for the young people. Square dance was the most popular.
Missouri Synod Lutheran pastors declared close contact couple dances very sinful and placed them off limits.
There was seldom enough people or space for more than one square. There were 4 girls about Bertha's age, so the boys made it a point to see that these girls got to the parties. In the winter they usually traveled by bobsled. Upon arrival at a party, there was a grand rush to get the single girls out on the floor before the married women got there. Occasionally the party was at a place with room for 2 squares. This was the first dancing for Bertha, and her parents never danced.
I gather that she quite enjoyed it.
The non-dancing men played cards, while the women visited and arranged the midnight lunch. Music was mostly violin or accordion, and the boys paid the players. The girls brought sandwiches or cake, with the host supplying the coffee. Paper plates were unknown, so couples ate together from one plate, one cup. People were not squeamish and diseases were rare, as sick people stayed home. These parties usually lasted all night, with participants leaving just in time to get home for morning chores before sleeping most of the next day, Sunday, as this was not a church-going group. These parties were almost exclusively in the winter, as summer nights were too short and hot. As a result, when enough boys got to the party, they picked up the heater and carried out in the yard to make room for the party.
This heater was the prime source of heat for the whole house. The only other source was the kitchen range that didn't heat much.
Sometimes there was a very hot fire in the heater, but no matter, it was moved out anyway. Before the last boys left, it was their job to set up the heater again. Schooling consisted of reading, writing, and arithmetic, plus Christmas parties for the whole district. Basket socials were held, to which outsiders came.
Basket socials were usually where the girls and women brought a fancy lunch in a decorated basket or box, and the men bid on them. The money raised went to some specified cause. There would often be very spirited bidding for the basket thought to belong to an especially attractive young lady. It was supposed to be a secret as to who brought which basket, but often a favored young man got clues as to which basket to buy. Oh yes. There was a surprise once in a while.
There was an end-of-year program and graduation celebration.
Schools often were the center of the community social life.
In 1911 to 1912, the school, about 16 students in all 8 grades, had a lady teacher, and the big boys, 16 to 18-year-olds, played horse with her.
In other words, they were disrespectful and disobedient. Often these young teachers were very little older than the oldest students, and further were inexperienced.
The next year a man teacher was there. Some of those older boys did not return to school. The man drilled them hard enough to enable them to pass the state exams. Only 3 students, including Bertha, cared enough to try, thus becoming the first graduates of District 240 school. One year it rained much and there was trouble getting grain dry enough to stack. Grain bundles were cut open and spread out. Then, to save buying binder twine, they cut tall grass from a nearby meadow and fashioned tie bands and retied much of it. For Charles, grain and grass had to be perfectly dry before stacking it. As I look back, he did not have farm knowledge. 2 more years of hard work for them wasted. Financially, they would have been better off if they had stayed in town. There were rumors then of building a road along the full length of the 80 acres. Charles told Bertha that she would never live to see that day. One reason was that there was quite a swampy area to build on or through. In spite of that prediction, Charles lived to drive on that Perham to Fergus Falls road. There was an old gent that had some corn some distance away that he wanted to give to Charles. He went and got it, but refused to feed it to the animals, as it was so moldy that he feared it would kill them. Instead, he hauled it some distance away into a brushy swamp and dumped it. He thought it was a safe distance away. But the chickens found it, not because they needed it, and then laid green moldy eggs. He buried the moldy corn to stop the chickens from getting more of it. One time the wood ticks were very bad and the horses had many in their manes. Charles picked many out one time, and then made the mistake of pouring turpentine where they had been.
I would assume that was to prevent infection.
He nearly got killed doing that as the horses went wild. One year many crows settled on the grain stacks. Charles tried to shoot them, but couldn't get close enough, so he hid in the barn intending to shoot through between some logs. He didn't hold the gun right, and it kicked back, skinning his nose. Caroline didn't like living way out in the country, and she was determined to go back to Perham. She needed people always and was very lonesome. At the end of 2 years on the Richville farm, she got her way, and neighbors helped them move back to Perham. Charles went to work on the railroad section crew. This didn't last and he went back to the Globe Flour Mill. Caroline once again went to house cleaning and doing laundry. Bertha worked as housemaid and did other cleaning such as doctors' offices, dentists' offices and some business places. She earned more day cleaning than doing housework. Wages were only $3 a week, with only 1/2 a day a week off. Summer cottage cleaning brought $2 a day plus meals and transportation, with the employer supplying all cleaning needs. At this time housing was scarce and they had a house built which they moved into in October 1914. William died at the Faribault State School, and they had his body shipped back to Perham.
I don't know where he is buried but assume it might be the Lutheran cemetery.
During this period of time, 1912 to 1914, the owner of the Globe Flour Mill and a brewery east of Perham, Pete Schroeder, turned operations over to his sons. Peter was considered to be the wealthiest man in town. There were many saloons controlled by Peter. There were many beer parties that brought good money to the business. The boys tried to expand the business, holding parties in large cities, even to large splurges in New York City. That and many bad business deals caused the family to go bankrupt, and Pete died a pauper. Charles had a chance to hire one of the Schroeder sons, but refused to do so, as he didn't know how to do the work. It would then be Charles' job to give him hell, as the sons did to him when they were his boss. He just felt that would be wrong and didn't want to do it. The brewery was located east of town by the Ottertail River, and the building was made of locally manufactured brick. Gust Hort owned the brick factory, which was located southwest of town. Bricks were still being made there as late as 1911. Many houses and business buildings were built of these locally made brick. Such bricks were used in the first school and in the hospital. Gust had the reputation of being hard on man and beast. He worked them hard and fed poorly. The bricks were hauled in wagons manufactured in town by Louis Schmidt, Sr., who owned and operated a wagon factory in the northwest part of town. When Charles returned to the Globe Flour Mill, it was under new management. This time it went better, as he became a pal of the engineer. When the engineer needed a helper, he asked for Charles. Consequently, he learned to know all that was necessary about that old engine. He was persuaded to apply for an engineer's license and pass the tests. The company imported young men who had learned to run new machinery and had troubles with the ancient, temperamental machine. Then Charles and an old retired man had to come help them out. Until about 1913, cordwood was used to provide heat for the old steam engine. The switch was made to coal because it was handier. Shortly after Charles became engineer, he found that the engine had been tampered with during the night when the mill was closed. He found a handful of 1-inch steel pins scattered all over, so refused to start the engine until it had been completely inspected. They found that a window in the coal room had been broken. A man's pocket watch with a broken chain was also found. The watch was the kind with a cover, and inside the cover was a picture of a woman who had been the marshal's neighbor some years before. Eventually, the woman's brother claimed the watch. But nothing was done about the break-in. Charles was assistant miller by the time Bertha understood about his work. It was often said that he did all the work while the head miller sat in the office doing paperwork. Some of the millers had no idea which spout the flour came out of. Head millers were frequently changed, and it wasn't known whether they were incompetent or too good to remain in charge of such a small operation. When Bertha was about 9 years old, Charles took her on a tour of the mill. They went into a room where many machines were in motion, and he told her electricity was made for use in the mill. It was a dark room and very scary, with red, green and yellow flashing lights. The frightened little girl stayed huddled close to her father. The mill was 7 blocks from the house, and since Charles often had only 1/2 hour for noon dinner, he purchased a bicycle. People didn't understand why Bertha never tried to ride the bike, but it was father's transportation, and she was afraid that if she broke it, then he would have no transportation. The mill produced 2 brands of flour. Clayton's Best. Clayton was a partner when the mill started, and Globe's Best. Both came out of the same spout. But there were those customers who swore by one and disliked the other. The flour was delivered to stores by horse-drawn wagons. One day the driver made a mistake and delivered the wrong flour to 2 trading posts located very near each other. Each store carried only one brand. Instead of taking it back, the mill gave the stores a special price and an apology. The stores in turn sold it at lowered prices.
At one time I heard that the deal caused such hard feelings that neither store bought flour from the Globe mill again.
Flour in those days usually came in 100-pound cloth sacks, and the cloth was often turned into clothing. The story goes that one day a Polish woman came into the mill office to complain about something. She was having great difficulty getting the man to understand her, and finally turned around, lifted her skirt and patted her rear. Her bloomers were made from a flour sack and still had Clayton's Best plainly printed on it. This was one of the chuckles Charles shared with his family. In late 1914 or fall of 1915 started a business course that was offered locally. Charles kept discouraging her, saying that there would never be a job in Perham for her. She never did finish the course, but found that helped her in later life. After she was married, she found it necessary to keep an account of many things. Even before that, she got into an argument with someone about writing a check. A knowledgeable person was consulted, and it pleased her that she was right. In 1916, Caroline wanted to visit her brothers and sisters in New York City, but didn't want to go alone. Charles didn't want to take a leave from his job, so Bertha went with her. After getting to New York, polio was bad and there was talk of quarantining the city. Caroline was so sick with dysentery that she was unable to travel, so Charles came to New York. About that time her health improved, so she and Charles went home. Bertha wanted to see more of New York and found a job as a housemaid, evenings and one day, after breakfast, off. She was expected to cook plain, everyday meals. Charles kept coaxing her to come home, and she finally did so after 11 months. She had developed some problems, which she attributed to being homesick, and never had the urge to return there. While in New York, Bertha was escorted around the city by her male cousins. Among the things she saw was a vaudeville show, Madame Butterfly and the Ice Follies. She described the Ice Follies as a very long production that was beautiful. Ice Follies featured blocks of ice arranged on stage, and then performers did figure skating and other fancy moves on them. Many New York people were curious about Minnesota and coaxed her into telling stories, which she later described as being Wild West tales. At times she was the butt of many of their jokes, which embarrassed her.
I'm sure the New Yorkers felt with some justification that they had a naive rube on their hands.
She was surrounded by handsome male cousins who joined in the good-natured teasing. 60 years later, she reflected that had she had more experience, she would probably have helped it along. At the time Bertha started for Minnesota, there was a special promotion for an excursion to Niagara Falls. Charles had heard of it and urged her to take it. She did so and found it to be quite a sight to see then. Bertha soon found jobs in Perham. People needed clean clothes and washing machines were not yet popular. People were willing to pay to have clothes washed, houses cleaned and food prepared. There was very little ready food on the market. At that time, 1918, a widow was anxious to get rid of her land and Charles, still dreaming of farming, was willing to part with his money. The land was rented to an adjoining neighbor, who took advantage of an ignorant about farming city guy. It was wooded brush land and considered to be pasture for cows and horses. It took Bertha a long time to learn otherwise. There were a few very small patches of tillable land separated by strips of brush and stumps. That worked okay with horses and walking machinery. Since Charles wanted the brush and stumps cleared between the tillable patches, he hired a man to do some grubbing. The man later died in the flu epidemic. Someone was hired to break the virgin soil and connect the small patches. There was a tumble-down log house and a log barn on the property. With a bit of fixing, the house was livable, so they moved out to the farm. They managed to cut and store some hay out there. In the spring of 1919, they went to get a load of hay for the cow and horse in town. Caroline tumbled off the load, landing on her head. With help, they managed to haul her to the hospital. Nothing was done about the injury, so it was assumed that she had sprained her neck. Caroline did have a headache and sore neck for the rest of the summer. About 1919, there was a big tornado in Fergus Falls. They were harvesting hay. The sky was completely overcast and they heard what sounded like muffled drums.
Fergus Falls is about 40 miles from Perham, maybe less in a straight line.
Bertha married William August Bill Schultz on March 31, 1921. Their courtship was short. Bill wanted to take Bertha to his grandmother's as his wife, not just his girlfriend. There was no big wedding.
They never talked about it, so I don't know the reason. I do know that Bertha absolutely refused to participate in any big celebrations for her. I know they disappeared in 1971, so no one could have a big golden wedding celebration for them.
There was the traditional shivaree in Richville. A city-bred cousin of Bertha was there and was terribly excited since this tradition was new to him. After Bertha married Bill Schultz, March 1921, they were encouraged to fix up the old log house and move in. Bertha reflects that that was a very foolish thing to do.
I firmly agree. He would have been better off following his trade of butchering.
The following years were difficult times. They always had plenty to eat and wood for the stoves, but luxuries were virtually unknown. A barn was built to house horses and cows. Money for barn material came from the sale of a 20-acre meadow near Richville that Bill had bought at some time.
In later years, 2 lean-tos were added and eventually a silo was erected.
Much land clearing was done and fences were built. Bill and his parents had the habit of purchasing worthless or marginal land. The home place of about 30 acres where Adolf and Minna Schultz lived was nothing but swamp holes and knolls. One swamp hole was used as a sawdust dump for the stave mill located next to it.
I remember Bill telling about working in the stave mill.
The stave mill wore out at about the time suitable trees in the area were all gone. Then they bought a 13-acre tract north of the railroad tracks. This land was too low to farm, was covered with brush and was called cow pasture. Cattle would not eat the type of grass that grew there and instead ate leaves from the trees. This was not adequate, so they had to be fed in the barn also. Someplace nearby, Bill had purchased the 20 acres, which he later sold to buy barn building materials. This tract produced some coarse, wild grass that was stomach filler for the cows, but not good nutritious feed for them. He also bought a 40-acre parcel that had nothing but large stumps on it. The land was okay, but it took lots of backbreaking work to clear. Most of that clearing was done after he and Bertha were married.
I was told at some time that they lost that 40 acres during the Depression of the 1930s.
There was one good thing on this acreage, and that was a gravel knoll, which provided good gravel for concrete work. As long as Bill kept the pit clean, it yielded good clean gravel. When he allowed others to get gravel, they let topsoil get into the gravel. This contamination caused concrete to be very weak. Bertha and Bill continued to live in the old log house. The main part of the house had wood shingles, but the south lean-to that was used as a kitchen had tar paper roofing. In August 1921, a hailstorm just shredded the roofing. Therefore it rained in the kitchen long after it quit raining outside. Fortunately, nothing in the kitchen was damaged by a little water.
This is the log house I was born in, and in my teen years I demolished it. The lower part of the house was built of large oak logs flattened on two sides with an adze or similar tool. The gable ends and roof were made of sawed lumber. I'm not sure about the rafters, but they may have been poles that had been flattened on one side.
Several times they tried to have a well dug or drilled near the buildings. Once a large rock stopped the well driller. One well was so poor that the animals refused to drink the water. Coffee made with this water looked like mud. Finally, they hired a driller with larger equipment and tried another spot. He went down some 180 feet to get usable water.
Less than 1/2 mile to the south, on the west end of Bodigheimer Lake, the homestead had a near artesian well. On the north shore of the lake there was a free-flowing spring of good clear water. About a mile to the northeast, the farmer had only to drive a sand point down about 25 feet to get good water.
When the 70 acres to the west and south of the original 80 acres became available, they bought it. There was much more backbreaking work to make that land tillable.
The 40 acres just west of the home place had a log house on it that was used for a granary for many years. That building had lots of holes in it where rodents helped themselves to grain. The other 30-acre parcel was to the south of the original 80 acres. It was mostly swamp with a sandy knoll on the lake shore. The knoll was used as summer pasture for some years. The swamp was ditched and drained to allow the harvest of wild grass and later some reed canary grass, which was used as hay for horses. In the 1930s drought, this hay kept our animals alive through the winters. The swamp was peat over marl. If a person broke through the peat sod, the marl provided no support. It was always challenging to keep the horses working steadily over the shaking ground, and it really got interesting when a horse stepped on a spot where he broke through.
On the north end of the original 80 acres were many big old oak trees. The winter of 1921 to 1922, a friend wanted a place to stay and agreed to help cut those trees into cordwood as payment for room and board. At that time it was discovered that those trees were hollow and many of them had been bee trees. Much beeswax was found. Starting out without anything is tough going, as money is going out and not much coming in. There were hard times all over the nation, and the Schultz family had their share of it as beginners. Many banks went under, and what little income they had went with it. They managed to stick it out as jobs were scarce, thus there was no need to quit and try something else. Most of the machinery was really Adolph's. In exchange, Bill did most of the farm work in Richville, as his father was old. He died of cancer a few days before his 65th birthday, which was considered quite old at that time. Since that time, medical science has kept people alive and healthy longer. Now we are not old until we are hit 80. Recently, February 1989, Rose Walls of Perham died at the age of 102. In the 1920s and 1930s and earlier, no one had money with which to pay any amount for cattle or horses. Hence very little sale for livestock. The old log house was wearing out.
It had no foundation. The lower logs rested on the ground, so it was just sagging into the collapsing cellar hole.
In 1936 the government finally gave the World War I soldiers their $600 bonus. With that money an old Richville lumberyard building was bought. 2 neighbor boys were hired to tear it down and salvage the lumber. Most of this lumber was used for the house that these same boys helped build. One of the boys, Al Jung, recalled that he was paid 15 cents an hour and was very happy to get it. Richville was quite a town, even before Bertha knew about it. There was an elevator, a box factory, a stave mill, a heading mill combined, lumber mill, sawmill, pickle factory, really a pickle salting station, planing mill and a specialty wood buying station. There was much timber of the type wanted for the various uses. This timber was harvested with cross-cut saws and axes. Most men did not bring their families to the area, or were single. Boarding houses were not government regulated, consequently anyone who had a spare bed and another spot at the table took in boarders. If 2 wanted to bunk together, that was okay. Minna Schultz had boarders. There was a large building with many rooms near the railroad tracks. The woodcutters had shelters in the woods where they bunked. When it became too cold to stay there, they left the area. Some of the trees were not suitable for the mill. That was cut into cordwood lengths and eventually hauled to Perham.
I assume for fuel.
Some cordwood was ranked alongside the Saline R tracks and loaded onto rail cars. A Canadian meat packer ordered a carload of maple wood.
No doubt for smoking meat. Other woods give the meat a bad flavor.
The woodcutter did not realize the reason and mixed in other good hardwoods. As a result, the whole load was rejected.
I have a few more notes of my own and some memories I hope to add, but since it took over 12 years to type this up, don't expect anything soon.